Welcome to Draft Sickos on the No Ceilings NBA YouTube channel and podcast feed. This is the show where we cover everybody from the biggest of names to the deepest of sleepers. I am one of your hosts, Maxwell Baumbach, joined by the real star of the show, Stephen Gillespie. Stephen, how are you doing today?
Maxwell, I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. We are wrapping up a series today, and man, like by every show, we get closer and closer to the draft. I'm excited. How's your weekend been?
I'm exhausted. So the wife's been a little under the weather, so it was just me and the kiddo living the dream yesterday. I rather foolishly made a ton of plans. I was like, it's gonna be great. We're gonna go to a bakery. We're gonna go to a farmer's market. We're gonna go to a museum. Like we did 800 things, and then by the
sounds like an episode of Daniel Tiger.
It was, yeah. Well, yeah. She was talking about Baker Acre on the way to the bakery.
Oh, perfect.
She's like, I'm going to bakery just like Daniel Tiger. It was great. So it was so fun. And then by 4 o'clock, I was like, this was a huge mistake. I have nothing left in the tank, and she's 2.5, so she's totally fine. So it was exhausting today. Today's been a lot more normal, which is good. So yeah, can't complain. It's been fun. How are you?
Man, I'm doing good. Kind of similar to you in a sense. Brianna, her mom is a couple hours away, so she went to go visit her for a little bit this weekend, and I was solo dad, not single dad because I'm still married no matter where she is. Solo dad, solo dad with 4 kids, and went to the splash pad. I cooked nonstop. They never quit eating. They will eat all day long, and they never eat at the same time. I'm exhausted.
Oh,
but
dude, yeah.
Speaking of exhausting, we have some projects coming up for No Ceilings, right? And I'm trying to put my work into bins because I'm very much let me work on this. I'll come over here, work on this, and then I'll work here. I started looking at next year's class based on players that are returning. Obviously the major freshmen. I've been going through the recruit rankings for all the different outlets and stuff. And then I started, true to the name, started looking at the Sicko prospects already, JUCO, NAIA, and all that stuff. And man, next year's class, we're going to continue to talk about this one.
Yeah,
but we could take a little bit of a break because, we've been talking about these guys all year. Next year's class, dude, my board is already fat. And I'm just thinking oh my goodness, there are going to be really good players that might not even get drafted.
It's going to be wild. Yeah, I was thinking about it. First off, the fact that we're having a text conversation today about the NAIA and D2 transfer ups that we and JUCO guys. It was man, that in and of itself is just kind of a sign of how wide open everything is becoming in the college basketball landscape, where it's certain guys are just I don't want to say getting missed because of the transfer portal, but guys are just going on different journeys than they were before.
Yep.
And I think everyone is looking for talent all across the board at the college level. If you talk to college assistants, the guys that they are on early, I feel I'm early on guys generally, and then you'll talk to college assistants and they know guys that
yes,
have you seen this guy at community college northwest of the South of Tennessee? And I'm yeah, sure, yeah, I've heard of that guy. Nope. Yeah, they're all over it. So it's really cool. It's fun to get deep in the weeds. But your point, the depth is going to be crazy because next year, do you remember years ago where they were at some point they're going to bring back high school to pro pipeline, and there's going to be a double draft where it's the one and done guys and the high schoolers in the same year, and it's going to be a double draft, and then that never happened. But next year we are getting the old guy double draft. We're going to have the guys who are seniors that are out of eligibility, and we're going to have the seniors that use their COVID year. And we're basically going to have 2 classes worth of old guys, given how many players went back to school this past year. And I think it's going to be really interesting to look at in hindsight. We're obviously, I don't want to fault any of these guys. Like Coleman Hawkins is going to get a gigantic bag. Coleman Hawkins is going to make way more money. Probably. I don't know the specifics. I don't know his financials. He's probably going to make way more money playing in college than he would have at the NBA level next year. But I do wonder if guys are going to look back and be oh man, would I have been a second rounder? If Jameer Watkins' shot trails off. You know what I mean? A lot of these guys, it's you're kind of playing with fire long-term a little bit, I guess. It's going to be really interesting to see. But yeah, the depth, because of the amount of guys that just can't go back for another year, paired with a better freshman class, a good mix of returners. There's just a lot of talent. You still got your KJ Evans, your Kwame, your Colin Murray Boyles, like all these other guys that like went back that could have stayed in this year.
Yeah.
It's going to be loaded. It's going to be absolutely loaded.
Hunter Silas, shout out to Hunter Silas.
Yeah.
It's wild too. Like I'm even thinking about, speaking of Hunter Silas, like I for sure would have drafted him in the first round this year. And I'm already kind of like looking ahead for next year and like trying to gauge where some of the freshmen will be and like trying to remember that, okay, like even in the best of drafts, like on average, like 13 freshmen get drafted in a draft class, right? And then I think about all the freshmen from this year's draft class that have gone back, like Omaha Blue or Scotty Middleton or Mbako, like all these dudes that are like, man, there were such high expectations for these guys who they bounced back in their sophomore season on top of the freshmen that are already coming and on top of people who I would have even considered in this year's draft going back, like a Mark C too. Like, oh my goodness, thinking about him in this year's class. And man, like next year's class is gonna be wild. And Maxwell, just kind of pull the curtain back a little bit more. You and I were already talking about going to the Portsmouth Invitational, and we're talking about, dude, there are going to be some like very talented players more than likely going to be in that. Not these, obviously there's talented people in there all the time, but like Enrique Freeman took advantage of this and is probably en route to at least the second round, if not priority undrafted free agency contract because of Portsmouth. And we knew all about them, but there are going to be like some kind of household names that we're going to be able to watch next season. And
that should be there, in my opinion.
Yes.
Because I think like we saw it this year. There's some guys and like you never know what the conversations were, like why things like this happen. So I'm going to say this, and I don't want to throw the guy under the bus if he like, didn't get an invite or like whatever the specifics were. But like this year, Boo Booey didn't play at Portsmouth.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't get the elite camp invite. And like you see all these college basketball reporters being like, "Oh, Boo Booey was like the man, like you should have gotten the invite or whatever." And it's like, you're really playing with fire if you're not playing at Portsmouth. And again, I don't know, maybe he just wasn't invited. Who knows? But to me, it's like there's guys every year that turn it down and then don't get into elite camp and regret it. And like next year, there's going to be so many older prospects that like regardless, we're going to have a stacked Portsmouth. But I also think it's going to be like imperative to play at it because if someone blows it out at this extra loaded Portsmouth, like they are going to get the elite camp and combine invites. So like you've really got to be ready to like come out and fight when you're in that post draft mix next year. It's going to be so fun.
Yeah, and I'm already starting to prepare for that fight too because like I mentioned, I'm looking at that board and I think each year it's going to get more comprehensive the longer that we just keep doing this, Maxwell. And I'm not joking when I say that they're like already, and there are going to be more names that pop up. It's just the nature of the beast, right? But I have over 600 prospects on my it's way too early board, just between returning prospects, you know, players that I'm projecting to get better, the JUCOs and NAI, and then the incoming freshman crop. I mean, it's insane, but I'm going to take about a week off after the end of this year, and I'm going to get right into it, man, because I cannot just not do anything. I just idle hands are not good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's get to our topic for today. So we've been doing this Sicko series here, talking about guys that we like as second round prospects, two-way or undrafted targets, and Exhibit 10 targets. We are going to kick it off today with one of my guys here, Dillon Jones. So Dillon Jones is a Weber State prospect. He tested the draft waters last year and ultimately decided to come back to school. He's been on my radar for a long time. I covered him for No Stone Unturned prior to the 22-23 season, so after his sophomore year. This past year, he scored 20.8 points per game, 9.8 rebounds per game, 5.2 assists, 2 steals, and 0.1 blocks, 54, 32.4, 85.7 splits. He is 6'4.5", I believe, with either a 6'10" or 6'11" wingspan. He weighs 236 pounds. So he is a big, bulky dude with long arms for his size. Really, really interesting prospect to me. Just to talk about his game first off. He is like a dribble, pass, shoot wing. He's got really exceptional vision, very strong downhill, but just really slick with his handle and his footwork and how he manipulates screens. He can live dribble pass with either hand. just really, really great view of the floor at all times. Nice pull-up game in the mid-range. The shot is a little questionable. So he's been kind of up and down as a three-point shooter. There are times where he can hit some really deep ones. He's not always the most willing shooter. He passes some up. 5.5 attempts per 100 possessions, which is on like the lower end for like a wing forwardy kind of guy. But he's always been great at the free throw line. Took 6.8 free throws per game this past season, made 85.7% of them.
Jeez.
Super, super physical, like just always using his body and his power. And at 236, that's something that's going to scale up pretty well. Like it's not, and again, like we were just talking about this guy, he's a guy that we like, Enrique Freeman, really physical guy, really high motor, but like 210 pounds or like more in that range where it's like, I love how hard he plays. I'm just not quite sure what this looks like. With Dillon Jones, he's got a level of power where it's going to scale up. So offensively, the big question you're really looking at is going to be the shot. The three ball has just never been super consistent for him. And then we should probably get into the defense because that plays a role as well. Defensively, he's a good steals guy. Really knows the game. Like the processing that allows him to be such a great passer shows up on the defensive end as well. Like he knows where to be at all times. When he throws his body on a guy, can really limit them and make it difficult for guys to get to their spots. It's tough to make too much of the defense because he was such a high usage player offensively. Like defensively, sometimes the effort wasn't great. He plays really far back off of guys, like farther than he needs to a lot of times. I thought he gave guys too much space a lot of the time. And he's very ground bound. So he's this exceptional rebounder, but like he really can't jump. So there'd be times when he was the lone man, we'd get into position, he walls up really well, he stays vertical, but he doesn't really get off the floor at all. So he's a really complicated evaluation because on one end you can look at it and you can say like, hey, the production here is off the charts. Like I'm trying to remember if this was the last 10 years or if it was in history. I ran a BART query the other day. Which some people are not allowed to do, by the way. Sometimes it's unethical.
And I would say if it happened past 10 years, then like don't even talk about it.
That's my
basketball
thing.
Was invented like in the 2010s.
So people have said like you need to use the full BART database. I personally just don't agree with that. I think basketball was a lot different over 10 years ago. But regardless, it is exceptionally rare for a player to have a defensive rebound percentage and assist rate both over 30 and a steal rate over 3. I believe it's Hollinger that I've seen call those like the feel factor stats before. And like the feel is unbelievable with Dillon Jones. To Dirty Dancer's point, he goes left a lot, which makes him a little bit easy to telegraph. The shot is an issue. The athleticism, especially like the bounce, is an issue. Defensively, like the effort has to scale up. I feel like whatever happens with Dillon Jones, it's going to feel like it should have been inevitable, right? Like if he sticks, it's like, well, oh my gosh, like look at how productive this guy was.
The production, of course.
And if it doesn't work, it's like you bet on a 6'4" guy who can't jump or shoot. Like, you know what I mean? Like it feels like whichever way this goes, it's going to feel like it should have been obvious. And I think that's what makes him so fascinating and such a complicated evaluation. I love Dillon Jones if I can get him in the second round because I do think the shot is workable given just the overall touch. I think he's a really smart player. I think if you look at the playoffs, you see very few guys who are physically weak, especially on the wings. So I really, really value strength. And I just think that when you get him in a different environment, like a lot of the stuff he does well is going to pop and you're going to be able to kind of hide some of the weaknesses a little bit. And I trust guys to be able to shoot when everything else is there. And it's just like the one thing they can really focus on. The defense, I think, might always be an issue. And if it is, I don't know how much that holds him back. But I just think at a certain point, the brain productivity and strength make him worth the swing. What do you think of Dillon Jones?
I love him. And I think that, he's a real versatile guy. I have a tendency to kind of fall for this player type a lot. And I want to kind of get into the philosophy here in just a minute, but you already touched on, I was going to bring up the 31% assist and defensive percentage and the 3% steal just because it's like outlierish, right?
Yeah.
Something else to consider is like he's not just the motor, but he's a great decision maker as well. Because if you look at the 31 usage percentage, he only had a turnover percentage of 16, right?
Yeah.
So that's fantastic, right? you touched on the fact that he's like a pretty ground bound guy, like only 5 dunks on the season, not a high blocks guy either at all. So very low blunks guy. I don't know if people remember the blunk stat that we came up with, but he is not atop the blunks leaders, right? With the versatility being like the main skill set for him, that's kind of what I'm thinking, right? Like there's not like one calling card that he has as a definitive skill set, but the versatility is kind of like what he hangs his hat on right now. One thing I want to kind of touch on first, though, is that the defense kind of waxes and wanes a little bit, Maxwell. But I also wonder, like, how much of that has to do with the fact that he is like the offensive hub. Like, he can't afford to get into any sort of foul trouble, because if he is out of the game, then Weber has no offense that they can turn to, right? So I kind of give him a little bit of a pass for that because of the steals numbers being kind of in the position that they are.
Yeah.
It shows feel on the defensive end, but if he gets in foul trouble, then Weber has no offense that they can run at all, right? So he kind of has to, I think, sort of mail it in. But let me ask you this, Maxwell. There's 2 players that I want to kind of bring up in comparison with a Dillon Jones. Because with versatility being the primary skill set, you kind of wonder if he's like jack of all trades, master at none. How big of a jack is he, right? Vince Williams Jr. was a big jack of all trades guy, right? And I was very big on him coming into the draft as like a late first round guy. And the reason is just because he could do so much, right? He's obviously, I think, a little bit more athletic as well, but he could just do so much on the floor. And then the other guy is Jaylin Slauson, a guy who we both liked a good bit too. Now, I think that we can look at Vince Williams Jr. and say, well, look at all that he's able to do for the Memphis Grizzlies, but his playing time was actually like out of necessity due to injuries for that team, right? So he was given the latitude and the runway to be able to kind of go out there and do all these great things. Whereas Jaylin Slauson, it's taken him a little bit to kind of get that playing time. And I think that could be the same case for Dillon Jones. Like, how many NBA teams are looking for such a unique guy? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like and Dirty Dancer says he reminds me of Jordan Nwora. Well, Jordan Nwora was a great 3-point shooter and a fantastic rebounder, right? So like,
Dillon Jones is weird with Dillon.
Yeah, it's like he's guard size, but he's definitely not a guard, although he has like guard-like processing and feel. But he's not a guard.
Not there.
The shooting's not there. There's so much that he can do. So I'm like, what's the pathway to playing time for a guy like this?
It's very complex. And like one of the questions I almost wanted to throw at you is like, if the shot is there but the defense isn't, like, then where are we? Like, if he's offensive tilted, I think it's probably fine, but I'm still kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. Like, there needs to be some real like come up on both sides. I think of the Slauson Williams comparison, I feel like athletically he's much closer to Williams, but even Vince Williams like played so much bigger than he was. Like, he's one of those guys that's like 6'4", but like he played as if he was like 6'8", with how he blocked shots so much at the college level. Like, and obviously at the NBA level it's different. The other big difference too is like Vince Williams was just like gunning threes. Like, he took 10 possessions. Like, that's almost 2 times more. So, and then with Slauson, like, Slauson's a much better athlete. But with Slauson, like, I always had real doubts about how his offensive play style was going to scale up. Like, he was extremely back to the basket, which like I complained about a lot with him. And like,
kind of see that with Dillon a little bit
too. Yeah. So, and he's not the athlete. So it's like, if you're looking at it through that lens, it's like, well, then what is the path? And I think where I feel better about Dillon is I do think his face up stuff is a lot more polished than Slauson. Like, Slauson loved to go back to the basket, but when Dillon is facing up and like his handle is just a lot more functional, like his footwork is a lot better. Where with Slauson, it was just like, can you please just one time like face up and just get right to the rim against these guys? And he never really seemed as willing to do it as I wish he had been. Another guy I thought about a little bit with him, and like defensively, there again, like defensively, like it's hard. Just not perfect. But like Royce O'Neal is like kind of what I see the offensive role being. Like, ideally, maybe he shoots it enough, and then like he's kind of like this second side playmaker kind of guy.
Sure. But even Royce more athletic, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably more athletic. And like,
and then I
Kyle
wonder
Anderson,
too,
like you just look at the block numbers, and it's just it's really
well, you got to
tough.
compare everyone to Kyle Anderson, right? Like that's a draft podcast rule. Like there's got to
If a
be
guy's
one
not that
Kyle,
athletic,
Yep. That's your, that's the ace in the hole. I want to ask you a question. Let's keep it relative to this draft class, because I feel like Isaiah Crawford in a lot of ways like has sort of the same thing. It's just that I think that he's even a little bit more easy to kind of like plug in, because he's shown the capacity to shoot at a reliable clip, and I think that, the defense is there too, right? I think that it's even there in a more functional manner. And it's just that the playmaking and I would say the processing is there for Crawford, but definitely not the playmaking, right?
Yeah,
So,
I trust Dillon Jones as an offensive decision maker more than I trust Isaiah Crawford.
But if you're going to give them both the same amount of decisions to have been made, like,
then I want Crawford.
Is the advantage that much higher for Dillon as opposed to like a 3-and-D power prospect?
Yeah.
And this is why I'm starting to like Crawford. Like as we get closer,
Crawford moved up really high. Like we were talking about him and like a couple other guys the other day, and I feel like he's a guy that has climbed up for me. And I think this is where it gets complicated with Dillon Jones too. Is like last year he was really good at the combine, and like this year he was fine. And it's like I really wanted you to like destroy the combine this year.
And we love Dillon Jones too. It's not like I mean, there's a reason we're talking about him. You know what I mean? Like we still value him, but it's just it's such a unique fit for him. And I think that's why he is ultimately a second rounder, is that if you draft him in the first, you're signaling that we want to use you in a clearly definitive way. And I think as a second, you can just say, we'll bring you in and you can kind of come in and maybe be Josh Hart, but not as athletic. Like, I don't know what
and with so many of these guys too, it's like, does that work with like the less athleticism? Does like the less athletic version of player A, B, or C work? Like, I don't know. And how much does the strength compensate for that? Like, how much does it matter that like this dude is long strong and he is powerful and he loves to throw his body on people? Like that stuff makes a difference. To me, like I ultimately just come back Dirty Dancing and Quentin Richardson with 0.
I was pulling it up the same time.
Like all these comps, I'm just like, man, I always get nervous of guys where I'm leery of the comp, because it's like, okay, well, if there's not a 1-to-1 comp, that makes me feel like nervous, but also there wasn't really a good 1-to-1 comp for Draymond Green where he came out. I'm not saying that Dillon Jones is going to be Draymond Green, obviously, but like if a guy doesn't fit, like if there's not a role that's being occupied that you can tell me like what a guy's going to do, I'm always nervous. And this is why I've come around to liking comps, is like, just at least give me an idea as to what the role is like.
Yeah.
The role. But yeah, again, though, I just keep going back to like, this is a guy who is clearly very smart, very physical, and very productive. And I don't want to be too low on that. And the other thing I'll say too is I think, based on conversations I have, I think people like Dillon Jones, the guy, too.
Yes.
And that matters a lot on the margin.
Absolutely.
Like, if I'm bringing in a guy who is 22, 23 years old, like, I need them to have their stuff together and, like, know what's happening on a basketball court and not be a step behind at any point mentally. And Dillon Jones is not going to have those problems. Like, he's not going to come in with an out of whack idea of what he is. He's going to come in, he's going to know terminology, he's going to know how to read the floor, he's going to know the right way to play. Like, those things are not going to be a problem with him, based on my understanding of him and just things I've heard about him in the situation. And even just like, I don't think Corey would mind saying like the experiences like Corey has had, like coordinating
interviews, him like every 4 months.
Yeah. Well, like he's had him on shows a bunch, and like he's always said good things about him. So that plus just like stuff from the NBA side, I think Dillon Jones is a guy who has done himself a lot of favors as far as how he carries himself. So yeah, I like Dillon Jones a lot in this second. I wouldn't like hate a team taking him in the first. Like, I think there's worse guys a team could take in the first round. But I'd feel much better getting like these hyper productive guys in the second. I feel like tend to provide pretty good value a lot of the time.
Yeah, Victor Wembanyama, shout out. He's in the middle of finals. We have Victor Wembanyama tuning into YouTube and talking a lot about Ryan Dunn. So thanks, Wemby. We love Ryan Dunn. You know, we've talked about him quite a bit. Yeah. I would talk to your front office though. You know, they're more likely to be able to get that done for you, bud. But yeah, I mean, Dillon is obviously, we love him, man. He's super productive. And he, like you mentioned, the way that you put it is beautiful, because I'm not going to be surprised if and when he goes to an NBA team and it's just like, I can scale. Like, that's the thing, is like, he could lean into so many different aspects that happen within the game of basketball, and like almost kind of like a 2K slider, right? Like, you're lowering maybe one aspect of his game so you could bump up the points in the other. And I wouldn't be surprised if like a lesser role where people are cutting off of him constantly to pass, because he, there aren't other people on Weber State who can set him up the way that he can set others up. So I wouldn't be surprised to find out that he is much more capable as an off-ball player. We just haven't really seen it, and I like the prospect of being able to get him in the second too, man. That's a good call.
For sure. Let's move on to your guy here that you like as a priority second. Who do you got?
Yeah, I have Adem Bona out of UCLA, and I understand why he is not a first-round guy, because I feel like once you get past your Khalil Ware in this draft, like, there's a slew of centers that could be kind of considered as like a late first, early second. And I totally understand why we're not having Bona mentioned a lot as a first, because, he's not a high field passer. He doesn't project to shoot really much at all. He doesn't have ideal size. He's about 6'8" and a quarter inch without shoes. So close to that 6'10" in shoes. Some players can kind of make up for it. But here's the thing. I feel like Bona can, because if you look at his wingspan, it's almost a 7'4" wingspan.
Yes.
So very long wingspan. Among all the centers that tested in the combine, he had the highest vertical with a 40-inch vert. So supremely gifted athletically. I think that Yves Missy kind of gets like the most talented athletic center in this class. I think Adem Bona could give him a little bit more run for his money. It's just that UCLA has like a Twin Towers lineup that they often utilize, and Bona kind of played a lot more forward this year with UCLA than I think anybody would ever want to see. But I guess it's good to show that he has that versatility. The things that he can do, though, are still very valuable in today's NBA from the big man position. 8.7% rebound percentage is pretty good. Defensively on the glass, he did a good job as well. 18.3% there, 8.7% block percentage, 2.7% steals percentage for a big man, which tilts itself to that agility, the mobility, lateral quickness that he does have at his position, which can be very valuable. Wider frame, he weighed in at 243 pounds at his size. So someone who can set a good screen and is an ideal, perfectly good lob threat too, right? I think that he's going to be given a simplified role, kind of like what Dallas, if you're watching the finals right now instead of listening to us, what you see them do with like Gafford or Lively, but even to a lesser extent with like Atlanta with a Clint Capella, other big men like that, right? So I think that it's not the sexiest role, Maxwell, but, just he move, it's like Outcast. Shout out to Outcast. I like the way he moves, like I like watching him play basketball. He's very effective. And I think in the second round, if you need a big man, like let's say you're a team that's got multiple picks in this year's draft, you want to strike, the higher upside prospects within the first. But if you're a Washington, right, and you're going to get these wings and these guards that everybody, including us at No Ceilings, are saying like, you don't get a million wings now, like don't do that anymore. But let's say you do, you can always fall back in the second round, maybe even trade up a little bit if you like, and go get an Adem Bona, who I think Maxwell is a pretty safe rotational player.
Yeah, that's just kind of what I keep coming back to with Bona. It's like, I think Bona is a classic, not going to get killed out there guy. Like I use that phrase a lot with guys in the second, where I'm just like, you could do a whole lot worse than like this guy who I think you can plug into an NBA game and he can play and hold his own. I think you nailed it with the measurements. Like I wish he was taller. Measured great at the combine. There was some weird stuff last year. Like he was injured and then they did combine measurements and they came out like really short. And it was like, is that real? Is that correct?
I think it was colder that day, if I remember. It was a colder gym setting. Yes.
But yeah, it was also just like, well, like, because it was like a shoulder thing too. So it was like, could he even raise his arms? Like what's going on here? But yeah, measured awesome at the combine, played pretty well in the scrimmages, in the parts of the game that were on television. So I can't speak to the rest of it, which is a lot of it. But yeah, I think with Bona, the vision is really clear, right? Like he's this big who is very physical and super, super high motor. Like the motor does not shut off. One of those guys that people who have seen him in practices just rave about the level of competitiveness that he's going to bring, which again, like some people think this stuff is corny or whatever. I think for guys in the second round, it does make a big deal of difference that like they're not going to be an issue in practice. Like that in and of itself is like good,
especially big men.
But the fact that, yeah, they're just going to bring an extra level of like competitiveness and fire to your practice, I think coaching staffs really appreciate it. I think it's easier to earn the trust of a coaching staff when you're a guy that's going to go really hard all the time. And that's sort of the rep that Bona has developed at UCLA. And it's part of why like Mick Cronin is not a guy that plays guys that he's not feeling. You know what I mean? And he played at
especially younger ones
right away. Yeah. On a team that had some real expectations last year in particular. He's very physical and he like moves guys around, like even like bigger dudes. He'll kind of push them around defensively. He's got the speed to really do some interesting stuff on defense. And a lot of time that can be like, oh, well, like you can switch a little bit, whatever. And you can, but even just like if you throw a bad post entry pass, like he can just get out in front of that and get a steal. Recognition at the rim is good. Had an 8.8 block rate this year, but a 2.6 steal percentage is really high.
Huge.
For a center that like is more of a traditional rim protector in some senses too. Like this is a guy, like usually you see the high steal rate and it's because the guy can't protect the rim. With Bona, it's like there's a little both in there, which is awesome. Offensively is where it's a little dicier. Again, like the motor stuff is there. He's going to get out in transition. He's going to run the floor really hard. He's super explosive off 1 foot. You can toss him lobs all day. He got a little bit better, I thought, at putting the ball on the floor this year. Still not a very good passer, like still just forces a lot of decisions in general, whether it be a pass or like a post up where there's just not a good look, or he gets the ball coming off of a ball screen while he's rolling and then someone slides in the way of the rim and there's not a dunk or a layup. And then he maybe tries to go into a post move and nothing's there. And instead of kicking it out, he takes the shot. Like that stuff needs to come around. And you know, he's, coming off of his sophomore year now. It's a little harder, I think, the longer guys in school to keep talking yourself into stuff. Like DC even says here, like dunks only, no other touches. I think that's why we're talking about Adem Bona as a second round guy. And I think there's a chance he goes in the second round and in a redraft, he provides value that lands him in the top 20. But I think it's hard with how high the skill barrier is in the NBA to take a center that's like this much of a play finisher. And I think the same thing is true with like Yves Missi too. And like Missi's younger, so like that helps him out a little bit. But like you just look at the centers that play real minutes in the NBA, and there's like 2 that have a negative assist to turnover. Like you've really got to be able to make decisions. And Bona can put the ball on the deck, but like he's just not a good passer. He doesn't see things very well. But he does enough of the play finisher stuff that it's like it's hard to imagine that he's not going to play like 10 minutes a game somewhere. You know what I mean? Like I think he has a very safe floor. I think the ceiling, like maybe there's more to it than I'm giving credit for, but it just feels a little like straightforward for me. Because like even
I
like
think that's fair.
Gafford minutes versus the Lively minutes in the last couple of series and how much different the on-off is. And I know on-off in like a series is a little trickier, but Lively being able to do so much out of the short roll has made those minutes so much more effective than they have been for Gafford. That like I don't know. Like I think that's just kind of like illustrative of why we have him lower than some of the other bigs in this class.
Yeah, and again, I'm not going to sit here and try to sell Adem for being something that he's not. I just think that the stuff that he is, you could still find a way to work that in. I mean, Victor Wembanyama in the chat has been going off, shout out to Wemby. He said, comparison right now, he likes the Charles Bassey. I think that that's pretty all right. And, that's an NBA player, but there's also, I think, the motor for Bona is what kind of sets him apart from some of these other big men. And motor for bigs is kind of like you either have it or you don't. And I think that Bona has clearly showed to play with his hair on fire, for lack of a better term, phraseology, right? And that matters for centers and that matters for NBA teams, especially when you're kind of offensively limited. Like if the only thing you can do is finish around the basket, but you're going to pout when you don't get the ball in your hand at the same time. Like, you're going to find your way out of the league pretty quickly. But Bona is going to give you everything that he can on the glass, on defense, on screens, and then diving as hard as he possibly can to the basket to finish over the top of somebody, right? So I have him kind of in that like early to mid second range. And again, if there's a team looking to get a center, once you get past like your Zach Eady's and your Khalil Wares, you really have Bona and then like Quentin Post or like your two big options for like a center in the draft, right? So if you need a center, I would prioritize Bona as like a second round target. And that's why I wanted to bring him up.
Yeah, I worry that I'm getting like a little too cute with it in the sense of like, I think you can just like play Bona in an NBA game. Like I think you just play him and he's fine. I think he hangs around for a long time. I just don't know that he's ever a guy that like gets a huge contract. And I know that sounds dumb, but like to me, the point of the draft is to get high value players, like inexpensive contracts. And like Duran Holmes, like is being brought up too, like
I'd have him higher than like your Zach
it's just such a different
type,
type of player. Yeah, like he's closer to that range because like the skill is really high. Like he's just a bit more of a rare player than like Bona. Like there's always going to be guys like sort of in this mold. I think what sets Bona apart is just like you said, he plays with his hair on fire. Like you can find this mold of player. You can't find that kind of work ethic very often. So let's do a quick break and we'll get to some of our guys that we like as, you know, late second or UDFA, like two-way targets. Stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, let's kick off this portion of the show. I'm going to toss it to you to talk about Auburn's Jaylin Williams, a guy that I've had my eye on for a while, and it's just really started to come together for him this past season. But I thought like just the pre-draft stuff, the enforcement was really good. He's getting a billion team workouts, which understandably so. But for people who aren't familiar, yes, there is another Jaylin Williams in this class. Stephen, talk to the people a little bit about what he is and what his game is.
Yeah, so Jaylin Williams out of Auburn is a guy who has been his process has been weird because he hasn't really like popped as like a consensus second round guy, but so many people love him. They love his work ethic. They love his build. You know, Rowan actually just wrote a great piece for our website at noceilingsnba.com. It's 100% free. You should go check that out. But Jaylin does so many things well. And what really kind of helped his stock take off was the fact that he grew as a shooter, right? The fact that he has been at a lot of invites without being invited to the combine after a pretty solid Portsmouth run tells me that he has a lot of fans. He's not a big like ball mover, which I want to lead with that because it is an important skill for like a wing to have. So the fact that you don't necessarily wanting a lot of plays running through him, but to him, I think that kind of limits him more as a forward, right? But he is a mature guy and he doesn't force things that aren't there too, right? So you can trust him to when he does make a pass that he's going to make the right one. He recorded a block percentage of 2.9 and a steal percentage of 1.7. So he's got the defensive tools and the athleticism to be a pretty impactful defender on that side. His rebounding isn't anything really to write home about, but it's not bad. So the fact that he is at least a stable rebounder helps his prospects, I feel like, as well. And I touched on it earlier, but the shot being up to about 40% this year is huge for Jaylin, right? Because he's not going to be a good playmaker. You don't really want him dribbling the ball too much, but if you can get him as an undrafted guy to come in as a two-way player, you're talking about a potential good 3-and-D prospect, which is one of the most valuable archetypes that you can get, right? Teams love these athletic forwards that can absorb contact, make threes, and play strong defense. The ceiling isn't that appealing with him, which is why I kind of have him in this range. But, I mean, you have a floor with Jaylin that could be like the 11th to 15th man on an NBA roster, maybe even a little bit higher depending on the team's ambitions and their roster construction, things like that. I'm just saying like ideal NBA championship team. You have Jaylin be kind of like that 10th, 11th man, maybe a little bit further on. very good contributor, pinch hitter in the regular season. Probably don't see a whole heck of a lot of him in the postseason, but you're doing well for yourself if you can build along the margins in an undrafted free agency with a guy like Jaylin, in my opinion, Maxwell.
Yeah, I think he's for sure a guy that, like, if you are, I do for like a real team, like if you're a team that's actually competing, a dirty dance with the obligatory, please don't do it. Okay, see comment in the
they
chat.
They have
to. If you're like a real team and you might need a guy to like eat some innings this year on a two-way that's like good, like Jaylin Williams is a guy that you should be considering. 7-foot wingspan at Portsmouth, 237.5 pounds. So like just built like a man, like a guy who's going to come in, like, again, with these older guys, like a lot of stuff matters more for them. And one of those things is build and body type. Like no one wants a 23, 24-year-old guy where it's like, he's got to figure out his body stuff. Like, yeah, it's nice that they're going to have like better maybe at the NBA level, but like, it's also nice to just have a guy that it's like, yeah, physically he can play in an NBA game and be okay. So the shot like looks a little bit funky, but the volume has always been solid, and he's never like, he had like one down year as a shooter, and like as a freshman it took him some time to figure out the shot, but we only played 14 games. Like I kind of buy it enough, like, and he took some deeper ones this year. He was taking more contested threes. Like I do think the shot will be good enough with Jaylin Williams. I like the defense, again, just like big, physical, long, not the quickest guy in the world, but a physical guy, competitive guy. And I think where I'm a little higher on Jaylin Williams is I actually really like his feel on both ends of the floor. I think he's a really smart player. I think he's a much smarter player than he's given credit for. And I actually like the passing a lot. Like I love how he will use like pass fakes and look offs on the way to the basket, whether it's to set somebody else up or to like get a rim protector off balance and get himself a cleaner look at the rim. Like he's a super, super effective finisher. Like he's always an elite finisher for a forward. And I think a lot of that is just like the manipulation and the little things that he does as an attacker to make it easier for himself at the rim, but also just like some of those interior dump offs and like spray offs to shooters that he's able to make, or stuff that I just don't really see out of a lot of the other like big bulky forwards in this class. With that being said, he is a big bulky forward who's like a below average rebounder, and like that's weird. And like he's, there were times where it's like, okay, well, he's on teams like Walker Kessler and Jabari Smith, so I get that. And like Chad Baker-Mazara is a really good rebounder for a wing. So like there's times where it's like, I can kind of see why he didn't rebound as much. I still would have liked to have seen that from him. But ultimately, I just see a guy that is like physically a grown man that I trust to make decisions, that I think is smart and can shoot enough. And because he's older, maybe he's not going to turn into, a future star, a starter, or anything like that. I just think you could do a whole heck of a lot worse than Jaylin Williams. And I think if a team drafts him, I get it. And I think if he goes a couple days into free agency and he's not on a two-way, teams are probably screwing up. Because again, like this is just a guy that you can physically put into a game and he's up to the task.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Now, I think you're a guy that you want to talk about as you're undrafted. Some people may be wondering, Maxwell, like, why are you considering him to be in this range? Because there's quite a few people like your guy earlier in the draft. So why don't you go ahead and break down who you got?
Yeah, so I've got Malique Lewis, who played in the G League this past season. I have Malique Lewis quite a bit higher than this. Malique Lewis is probably one of my favorite project players, I guess you could say, in this class. So if you're like, wait, who's Malique Lewis? I watch college basketball all the time. I watch the G League Ignite. Who's this guy? He played in the
I'm an Australian, watch the NBL.
Yeah. So kind of a new thing that the NBA did this year is they allowed different like international players or players who took just sort of different professional paths, like JaVale Leonard, to play in the G League on a different G League roster. So he was on the Mexico City team in the G League this past season, and he played a role for them. And you're like, played a role? Like, what does that mean? Like he was a good contributor on that team who played minutes. He was not the star of the show. So like, if you're going to compare, just his counting numbers to like Modest Buzelis and Ron Holland, you're going to be like, what? No, like no way. But if you look at some of the advanced numbers and even you just watch the tape and just see how he contributed on the floor, like to me, this is a guy that like I would if I have the tolerance for like a player that I can take, I would even consider one as like 4-year non-guarantees in the second round for Malique Lewis. I like Malique Lewis quite a bit. 6'8", long arms. With him, I think the biggest pitch is how well he can play a connective role on a basketball court. So across the full season, he had a 1-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, basically, but it got better down the stretch. For a 19-year-old without a lot of high-level basketball experience in the G League, you look at the assist to turnover numbers that the Ignite prospects put up this year, whether it's Ron, Modest, Darlin, Babacar, like they were not pretty. So for Malique, and granted he's on a better team, to be able to come in and just like not screw stuff up and make the next one swing pass and throw the occasional like interior drop off when he gets to the rim, that's great. I love that. I like to see that a lot from a player his age. So I thought he was kind of like up to speed on that front. He's got a little bit of wiggle. Like there's times where I'm like, oh, I don't know if this guy can dribble. Like the in-between game is not there. Like he's not a guy who's going to like drive and then see that he's been cut off and then do a slick, like step back between the legs and pull up and hit an elbow jumper. Like that's not there at all at this point, which is why, again, we're talking about him in the second round. But he's like kind of elusive downhill. He can get up off of 1 foot. He's just 0.5 ready as a decision maker. Like he just gets off the ball quick. He takes open threes and he can drive to the basket. And a 6'8" guy, there's just not a lot of those in this class. Defensively, there's some stuff that needs work. Like anticipation, particularly around screens, can be pretty rough. The on-ball stuff is a little bit raw as far as like his stance, where his hand placement is. Like there's stuff that needs to be tied up. But at the same time, his length was really difficult for people to deal with at times, and he plays really hard. And he had some really good off-ball anticipation moments. He ended the year with a 3.8 block rate and a 1.7 steal percentage. Made some really big plays. He's like a top blocker, had a big block on Modest Bezelis at one point this year. Like at a certain point, we know what NBA role players look like. They're guys that are long, that take care of the ball, that knock down threes and can play some defense. And like that's Malique Lewis. And I get that maybe it's going to take him a while to get there. You're probably going to have to park him in the G League. We haven't seen it in higher usage role. He had a usage rate of like 14 in the G League.
Yeah, very low.
But I think the plug and play pieces are there. And for a guy who's going to be turning 20, to at least just show that like he has the mental aptitude to play a role in the physical traits that are really desirable among NBA players, I'm very excited. And again, 37.7% from three during the regular season portion of the G League schedule, just 34 games. Like I think he can shoot. I think he can attack. I think he can dribble enough. I think he's going to be able to play defense. I love this guy. I love it. Like right now he's projected like undrafted by the ESPN board, I believe. I think he's outside of their top 60, at least when we put our initial list together. Like I'm sprinting to the podium to get Malique Lewis in the later part of the second round. But if he goes undrafted, that's the first call I'm making.
I could see it, man, because like Malique is an interesting player. You already touched the fact that he didn't put up like gaudy numbers in the G. And so the shooting is real to me, right? Because I mean, one, if you're playing in the G and you're shooting that percentage, you're doing it from the NBA 3-point line, right? And you're doing it against maybe not quite NBA level prospects, but NBA light. I mean, you're pretty daggum close. Like there's people that come in and out of, or come on and off of rosters that you're going up against, right? So you're already having that level of experience. You're doing it on an NBA size court. I worry about the ancillary parts. I mean, it sounds like you're more glass half full than me. I worry about the playmaking a little bit. I worry about the ball handling a little bit. The defense is actually pretty interesting, but it's just kind of like, it's almost like positionally outliery in a way that's like, how useful is it going to be? But I think that it doesn't hurt to have those tools and to have that anticipation to where maybe you're not going to be that level of shot blocker, but maybe that makes you more dangerous in the passing lanes and things like that, right? So obviously there's a lot to like there. I want to ask you a question though.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, he can withdraw from the draft by the 16th if he wants to, I believe. So,
yeah, the international like pro prospect deadline is what applies to him.
Yeah, so which means that he could stay in the G League, I guess, if he wanted to, where he could go like Europe or overseas, NBL or something like that. If he is not getting second, like essentially a promise, how likely do you think it's going to be that he stays in this draft?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm promising him if I'm in the second.
Yeah, I know you are.
Right? I know I am. I think that's a great question. It would be really hard to know. Like, he's a guy that I don't have a lot of insight on because, like, the situation was just so much different. Like, he was playing on a Mexico City G League team, so like,
small role,
not the
too.
same.
It's
like, and there's not the same, like, machine behind it. Like the Ignite has, right? The Ignite has people that are kind of like, I would say, like, doing some outreach and like kind of going to war for their guys a little bit behind the scenes. Where, like, with Mexico City, that's less a part of the operation. They're just trying to be a functional basketball franchise. They're trying to win games and be competitive and fill out a roster that fits the requirements that team is given, which are different than other teams in the G League.
But there's not going to be an Ignite program for him to, like, I guess, transfer up within the G. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, which, like, if Ignite still existed, I would love to see him, like, them be like, hey, you're going to try and, like, run the show here, and we'll see what this really looks like under some pressure.
Boy, could they have used him this year, you know?
This is, again, like, pure conjecture. I could not have less of an insight as to what is going on with him.
Breaking news. Camp. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. My gut says 50-50. My gut is like, let's see what options are there, because and it's so tricky because, like, this is a guy who didn't come up through traditional basketball path at all. My guess is probably he's just going to go wherever the most money is. And I don't know enough about the economics of, like, global basketball to know, like, what a EuroLeague team would offer him, or what a team in Spain, or what the NBL pays their next star guys. Like, I just don't have those insights. So my gut says 50-50 just because of where he's projected. And that's generally a toss up. Like, with most guys that are in that range in the draft, it's typically a toss up whether they go back to school or not. I would assume that's probably the outlook with him in a pro situation. I also wonder, like, would Mexico City just be like, get back over here. Let's run it back. You were really solid for us last year, and we want to be competitive to keep growing the game over here. So, like, if we get a 6'8" complimentary wing and can just give him a little bit bigger of a role, why not?
Yeah, I mean, he's turns 20 in November, so he's not ancient, you know, for being in the G League. And, you know, maybe I don't know how many next stars the NBL is bringing in next year. I think that, you know, this could be a good option. Should he want to explore potentially coming back. But Maxwell, we also opened the show talking for about 5 to 7 minutes about how loaded next year's draft class is going to be.
Maybe,
I mean, maybe being a priority undrafted in this year's draft goes a lot better for somebody who kind of has the mystique of a small usage and a small role kind of working in his favor, so to speak, as opposed to maybe a higher profile, higher usage role in a professional league. Like, maybe that does more damage than good, you know?
I think that's entirely possible. To me, like, Malique is a true, like, nothing's off the table outcomes kind of guy. Like, if you show me hey, he gets to the NBA and, like, just doesn't work when, you know, the same usage at the next level, or he can't scale up or whatever, like, that's entirely possible. To me, a 6'8" guy that, like, knows how to play with those tools and, like, plays hard and makes good decisions, like, that's the kind of bet I want to make. Like, that's the guy I want to roll with if I'm putting my chips down in the second. So we're gonna do one more break and we're gonna get to our favorites. It's the real Sicko hours, the E10, the Exhibit 10 portion of the show. So stick with us. We'll be right back on the other side. All right, we are gonna lead things off with a guy who is I believe 2-time G League Elite Camp invitee. That is Alan Flanigan. He was the guy that you brought up on as your Exhibit 10 guy. What are your thoughts on Alan Flanigan? He's a guy who had a really interesting path for college. Started at Auburn. Was initially, like, projected to be like an early second, like late first guy going into 21-22. Had some injuries, had a down shooting year. Goes to Ole Miss this past season, sort of reinvents himself a little bit, adds some dimensionality to his game. Very interesting player. Where are you at with Flanigan?
Yeah, so again, I want to kind of precursor. The Exhibit 10 is, like, really hard to find a perfect prospect, you know, in this range, right? So you have your philosophy. Maxwell, I'm looking at a guy who over 5 years averaged about 30% shooting from deep. So, like, not a ringing endorsement for a guy his size, right? But he has a bigger
and, like, a long arm guy.
Yeah, so bigger body, rebounds well, and always has always been someone who can mix it up in the rebounding area, has shown the ability to be very good at making connective passes. And you talked about like reinventing himself, so to speak, a little bit at Ole Miss. He really leaned into more of being a kind of a ancillary playmaker, which I think bodes well for him, right? The athleticism is starting to come back now after some of those injuries, and it looks like some of them were kind of prolonged in a way that maybe wasn't originally anticipated. But now you're looking at a player who at Ole Miss this year, 1.5 steals per game, gives you a block in 2 out of 3 games, right? That's a cool way to talk at a 0.7 blocks per game, right?
I love that.
Yeah. 2 out of every 3 games, you're getting 1 block from him, right? 2.8 steals percentage, 2.5 blocks percentage. Maxwell, the sell with him as an Exhibit 10 guy is like, I just like him as a hustle, grit, determination guy, like who's going to come in, be hungry to play, and is going to pretty much do everything but shoot. I'm not going to try to pretend like if you squint, like maybe you can see, good touch indications and all that stuff. The shot's just more than likely it's not going to be there, right?
Yeah.
But you get somebody who you can trust to make good decisions. If you experience an injury on a team, or you're looking to maybe refine your G League, or you're looking to maybe find someone who can come in and be at the very back of your rotation, someone like that. I think that Flanigan makes an ideal Exhibit 10 guy because he's strong. You mentioned like the benefit of like some of these older guys not having to figure out their body. Flanigan does not have to do that, right? So you got a guy who's just going to come out there and compete and hustle and do all the garbage man stuff. I love Flanigan in that regard. And, again, you're talking about a high character guy. Like anything that I've ever heard about him has just been nothing but a great guy, right? So that's what you want out of an Exhibit 10 guy, in my opinion, Maxwell. What do you think about Flanigan as an E10 guy?
Yeah, you kind of slowly started to sell me on him a little bit over the past few months. Like, it's a guy in this type of range. I think with particularly how certain teams like to fill out their G League roster, like he's particularly interesting in that respect. Where like, again, like it's just going to be a guy who competes night in, night out, like raises the toughness level of your team, and is gonna do a lot of dirty work. And like we've also talked a lot about like these like everything but the shot guys seem like safer G League bets because the G League just is so transient and up and down, and like it's so offensively tilted, and your roster isn't the same, and like it's really hard to be like, this guy needs to figure out like how rotations work on defense. Like he's really got to figure out that like there's certain stuff that I think is just a little hard to figure out in the G League, and like shooting is like something you can kind of figure out anywhere as long as you have the time and hopefully the touch and whatever to figure it out. I think a thing that the BPM boys would take issue with is he's like the guys with like the career BPM below 2.5 a lot of times is like sort of a death sentence for like a lot of players for whatever reason. Like it's just never been something that has big success rate. I do think Ben Shepherd is going to break that trend, and I would argue that he already has because he played conference finals minutes, even if he
started.
I think Ben Shepherd's going to be that guy. But typically just hasn't been a great indicator. I think what makes Flanigan different, like we mentioned, is that he did deal with a lot of injury like he dealt with a pretty severe injury setback that is uncommon. And then he had a very strong bounce back from it after the one really down year. And again, like you mentioned, the productivity as far as steal and block rate, both really good. Excellent rebounder for his position. I think he's a little bit savvier as a passer than people might realize. I think a lot of times you'll see those like athletic defensive guys and just assume like that's what they do. And it's like, like Flanigan like kind of has a bit of a handle. Like he can get to the rim. He can make some slick dimes. Like there's some more to him than that. And he was a good free throw shooter this last year. Made 81.7% of his free throws. Just a guy who competes. The volume was low on the shot. The percentage was bad on the shot. It's like, in my notes from like 3 years ago on him, I wrote that like it's a sidewinder jumper where like his feet are out of position, his knees are like to the side, like his torso is straight on, the ball's coming off his head. Like there's a lot wrong with it. Like it's
very angular,
a ground up rebuild on the jumper, but if the jumper gets there, everything else is there. And again, at this point, we're not dealing with prospects that are likely to figure it out, and that's why they're in this range. So to me, Flanigan is a guy where it's like, I'd rather try on this, where if it does come together, it's something of value, than if you're telling me like, hey, this guy's like really well-rounded, but he's not there. And it's like, okay, well then how is he going to get there? if it's a player that's already well-rounded but is not in this mix. Like, then what? So
yeah,
I like Flanigan quite a bit as an E10. And I wouldn't be stunned to see him get a two-way. And maybe it would surprise people because, again, like the 3-point percentage has been really bad over the years. But depending on how things shake out, if that's what a team values, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you could do a lot worse with all the other stuff in his game that he brings to the table, right? But we know how important 3-point shooting is for a wing. So that's kind of where he is, man. And again, I don't see, like, I can't squint and look and tell you that he's ever going to develop that. But again, as an E10 guy, you know, athlete, defender, good ancillary playmaking, good rebounder, like, just going to bring the intensity on a night-by-night basis. So, Maxwell, let's get to the last guy that we want to talk about before we end the show with a pretty neat little philosophy conversation that we're going to have.
Yeah. My guy here is going to be a player that I interviewed before the season, a player that is like on the ESPN board. He's like almost like out of he's like at the very end of their top 100. Yeah. I have him in draftable range. But I'm going off of like, hey, this is where like this guy is on public boards. And I do not see him on public boards very often. And that is Spencer Jones out of Stanford. Yeah. I am a big Spencer Jones guy. I've long been a big Spencer Jones guy. Spencer Jones played at Stanford. Weird season. And I actually kind of like him because of it, which we'll get to in a second. So Spencer Jones this year scored 11.7 points per game, 4.1 boards, 2 assists to 1.3 turnovers, 40.9% from three. And he's always been a very high stock guy. So 2.8 steals per game, 2.8 blocks per game. Spencer Jones has always, from a 3-point volume, 3-point percentage, and steal and block rate standpoint, those 4 stats, graded out as an NBA player. He is 6'7". He is like 230 pounds. He's built like a grown man. On that alone, like if I'm picking a guy to give an E10 or a 2A, or I'm picking at the end of the second round, you could do a lot worse than a guy who's got an NBA body, shoots threes like an NBA player, and produces defensively in a high major conference like an NBA forward. I like that about Spencer Jones. What I also like about Spencer Jones is, from interviewing him and hearing a lot of the characters around him, I mentioned like he's a grown man physically. He's a grown man as a guy. Very, very mature human being. People like to be around him. Very smart.
He did go to Stanford.
They don't like guys like me into Stanford. But yeah, very smart and just sort of a good kid by all accounts. The other thing I like with him is he's always taken good care of the ball. The turnover rate has always been low, but his assist rate was really poor. Like, he was always one of those guys where it's like, I score off of cuts or off of threes, and that's it. I thought the ball skills took a big step forward this season. You told me before the year his goal is to top 2 assists per game. He hit 2 assists per game. Prior to that, his career high had been 1.2 assists per game. So like, made a real leap as a passer and playmaker, and just viewing the floor and seeing more than like, do I just get off of the ball, or is my shot here? Like, he took a real step forward in that respect. I thought he was kind of inconsistent this year. If you look at the numbers and go game by game, part of that was Stanford just wasn't a great team. His touches came and went. The other thing with Spencer Jones is that he had a either hand or wrist injury, and this is working off secondhand information. If you watch the games, I think it's like late January onward, tons of tape on one of his hands, and it was a shooting hand too, I believe. That's why he didn't play at Portsmouth. I don't know if he met the G League elite camp, like invite list or not. From what I understand, he was not going to be able to play until like very late May or early June. You see him now popping up on team workout lists. He has slid under the radar because he didn't play at these events, and I think people haven't looked at the numbers or dug into the film because he's not a part of these events. I just really buy it with Spencer Jones. I buy the shot. I buy the defense. Maybe it never clicks at like a high enough level because he was always the guy who's like, good producer, not a spectacular one in any one regard. But I think he knows how to play. I think he's got the body. I think he checks the boxes that, like, I have a hard time just seeing him as a guy that's just like not at least on rosters for a while. And I look at teams like the Chicago Bulls in my area where it's like, I would love to have a guy who's taller than 6'5" that both shoots threes and plays defense. Like, I would love to have a guy like that. I look at teams like the 76ers, where it's like, hey, this roster is going to be kind of completely barren going into next year. We don't really know what we have. I think you can plug Spencer Jones in there. I look at a team like Utah that's building through the middle and just has a dearth of wing-sized players. And I think, man, it'd be really nice to just get another floor spacer like Spencer Jones out there to kind of complement
Phoenix being strapped for cash.
Yeah. Yes. Like I just go through like every roster in the league and I'm like, well, why wouldn't I just take a shot on this guy on a 2-way, but particularly an E10? If you're telling me this, I don't even have to put, serious money on the table for a guy like this. Sign me right up. So I love Spencer Jones. That's my tangent on Jones. But what do you? And I want to say too, one last thing. If there was a game late in the year where they played Cal, and we both love Jaylin Tyson, and I don't think this is like an indictment of Jaylin Tyson. Like we've talked about how that Cal roster was. I thought he outplayed Jaylin Tyson in that game. He played phenomenal defense on him down the stretch. He does not have the bag that Jaylin Tyson does. He is not as good of a prospect as Jaylin Tyson is because the bag isn't there. The in-between stuff isn't there. The mid-range stuff is not there. He's not as good as Jaylin Tyson. But I think that he outplayed Jaylin Tyson in that particular game, and there are ways that he showed that he's going to be able to impact the game at a really high level. That if you watch that game, you can just see like, wow, it's crazy that this guy doesn't ever get talked about really as a top 60 prospect. So I love Spencer Jones. That's my Spencer Jones stand.
I mean, I don't love him as much as you because I think the only person that does is his mother. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, I like him a lot. I was surprised that you mentioned him as a E10 guy, but it makes sense as to why, because I think that this would be a prime undrafted free agent guy, easily, because of the things that you mentioned. I mean, you're looking at a guy who shot his field goal percentage is low. It's only about 44%, but 41% from three, right? So like that's the sell with him. Weirdly had a 64.5% free throw percentage. I wonder if that's kind of like more related to the injury as opposed to like the 3-point percentage, so to speak. But, there were playmaking duties left on the table with Harrison Ingram transferring out to go to North Carolina. I think Spencer did a great job of kind of help supplement that role. And, he has talent on that team. I think people would just think Stanford and be like, oh, whatever. I think Maxime Reynald is going to be like a dude next year in draft conversations. Like he's kind of already been for his freshman year. He really was like it cooled off a little bit this year, but there's talent on that team, man. And Spencer being able to do the things that he did, playmaking being one of them. You talked about the steals and block percentages, both being about 2.8, rebounded well. You touched on the assist turnover stuff. The fact that he is improving as a playmaker at this very advanced old age of he turned 23 in June, or he turns 23 on June 14th. So like 23 birthday coming up soon, kind of similar to Dalton Connect in that regard. But I mean, does it put pressure on the rim? Who cares? Don't need him to. Just needs you to be in a corner, buddy, and play your butt off on the other end and get rebounds. I mean, he does the things that you want an NBA wing to do at the size of an NBA wing already. It's kind of a no-brainer. Once you said like, I would do this, I would draft him. I would definitely get him as an undrafted. And I am like particularly thrilled if I can get him on an E10 contract, for a couple times, and then eventually probably bring him into a rotation. I mean, he makes a lot of sense. And I love your philosophy, Maxwell, where it's like with E10, I'm just looking for a particular skill. And that is what Spencer Jones has to a T. Yeah.
Yeah. So we wanted to have a bit of a philosophical discussion to kind of end the show. I want to kind of breeze over some of this because I hate let's talk about Twitter drama on a podcast. I think that stinks.
I love it.
Let's let's talk about. There's been a lot of debate over like the concept of Intel and how much to value Intel from a draft philosophy standpoint. I'll kind of let you go first. Like, how do you incorporate Intel into your scouting process?
So first off, shout out to like literally everybody watching us. The finals are on. If you didn't know, like still please hang out with us. But the finals are on too. And I'm not gonna sit here and pretend to be smarter than anybody, because like I'm just not, right. But I think Intel is important. right? And where it gets tricky with the intel conversation for people who are not in front offices, where I think it's like an availability bias, right? Where
yes, yeah.
I don't have intel. I consider myself to be a good evaluator. I like this prospect. So if I don't have intel, therefore I don't find it valuable because I feel like I can still kind of do my job without it. So
yeah,
I think that there's that, right? Intel's obviously incredibly important, right? And it's good to just get the information, right? Like you want to know as much about these players as you possibly can. And I think that's where everyone agrees, Maxwell, by the way. I don't think that people who are kind of like, I don't even want to say anti-Intel, but like they're not as, it's not as relevant or as big as a priority as it is to other people, right? I think everyone would agree that you want Intel on all the prospects. Now, where people differ is like how much does it weigh into your decision? I think it would weigh in a lot. And Maxwell, you know, I'm looking at Twitter and I like talking about draft Twitter. I mean, like it's fun. I'm there, you know what I mean? So like why would I want to talk about it on a draft show, you know? So people love bringing up the Intel success stories, right? Like or like the aha, you know, like a Gigi Jackson or Cam Whitmore or, you know, Joel Embiid or Isaiah Hartenstein, you know, those types of players, right? But no one wants to say Kevin Porter Jr. had bad intel. And
Josh Jackson,
look at these guys. And then I think, Maxwell, there's also the likelihood that positive intel is going to be perpetuated out into the open more so than negative, you know, where there's two reasons for that, in my opinion. One is that it's a strategy advantage, right? Like if you have negative intel on somebody, you don't want to let that get out because it's kind of like a buyer beware for everybody else, right? And then two, it's just like, I don't want to talk negatively about a prospect. Like if you're not for me, then I'm just not going to draft you. You know what I mean? Like, and I hope that the intel that I have that I am kind of like choosing to listen to and like maybe invest millions of dollars in a different person, maybe, you know, you can buck that. And I hope you do. And I'm rooting for you. I just don't know if you're going to do that on my team. Like that's how I kind of value the intel.
Yeah. I think it is a piece of the puzzle. And I think it's something that is extremely case by case, which I know is like the cowardly take to be like, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. All right, see ya. Like,
sure.
I think that's like a cowardly way to put it. I think a lot of it has to do with like, what is the intel specifically? And what is my organization's risk tolerance for whatever these specific problems are?
Can I ask you a question?
We're
just to kind of
joined by a very high character intel figure, my daughter, who's wandering into the room at the moment. But yeah, ask your question.
So, because these exist, I'm just gonna try to like make this as I'm gonna ask this as vaguely as possible as to not connect.
Yeah,
but like, how much does like a super involved dad or a like a rocky maybe relationship, so to say, like you know, like a partnership, so to speak, like how much do you weigh that as opposed to like is routinely late?
So we're talking
stuff
like over
like
involved family as opposed to like stuff that directly impacts like my ability to run a practice.
Like or professionalism type
thing. I think again it just kind of goes back to like organizational stuff where like if I'm like I think I'm trying to think of examples of like guys that have had intel flags that worked where like with Cam Whitmore and like I think the knee was like more like knee stuff rumors is like more of why he fell than anything else. I think with Cam the stuff on the intel was more just like the from what I heard, and this isn't like super thorough, like I'm sure NBA teams probably know a lot more about this than I do. It was more that like the staff at Villanova wasn't like going to pound the table and like go to war for him and be like, he's awesome, you got to bring him in and whatever. To me, that's different than like, I have a friend who worked at a newspaper in Kansas while Josh Jackson was there. And like the anecdotes that he was telling me about Josh Jackson were like, oh, this guy's going to like get into some real trouble. Like this is stuff that is like going to be like an actual problem legally or like off the court, or like he's going to be disruptive in practice. We're not going to be able to install stuff that we might want to install. Whereas there were other players that were around Kansas at that same time that had some issues. But their issues were a lot. It was a lot more like, oh yeah, like this guy like doesn't pay attention in class or whatever. Where it's like, that's not going to be a problem. If he's fine in practice, I can live with him not paying attention in class. So I think that's kind of case by case. I think even like being late and stuff, I think comes down to organizational tolerance. Where if I'm Boston or Dallas and I am in the NBA finals, I don't want to deal with the guy who like might be late to practice. Like I'm straight up probably not rolling the dice on like those types of intel concerns. Where if a guy's got like an over-involved family or whatever, and like the dad thinks he should be starting or whatever, like that I can almost tolerate, because it's like, look, buddy, we're in the finals. Like he's just gonna have to suck it up and deal with it. We're like on the opposite end, if I am a rebuilding team and, you know, maybe you guys got some stuff that needs to be worked out, but I can sell him on the idea of like, hey, look, we know that you're late to practice sometimes. We know that like this is an issue. We're giving you the keys and you're going to have a chance to prove everybody wrong and be the star. But if you want to be the star, this is how it's got to be. Like there are not stars in this league that do this or that. Like, I think there's different ways that you can approach it given whatever a player's issues are. Relationship and like family stuff just personally just doesn't bother me. Like I maybe it would be different if I was working for an NBA team and I had a guy's like mom yelling at me every single day via text or leaving me voicemails or whatever. But to me, it's like everyone's fan. I don't know. I've had a lot of coworkers with like weird family situations or whatever, where it's like, yeah, they do their job just fine. Like that does not irk me quite as much. So maybe I'm alone on that. But to me, it just goes down to like, where am I in the team building phase? What do I have a tolerance for as an organization? And frankly, how talented is a player? Like if I believe a guy is really talented, I'm going to try to do everything I can to make it work and provide whatever structure a player might need, or do whatever I can to curb any bad habits they might have. Ultimately, I take it with a grain of salt. Is just my philosophy. Because again, we're talking about guys that are like 17 to 24 years old. Yeah. I was a complete idiot during that phase of my life. I'm still pretty dumb. But just to be pretty honest, like I look at the person I was during those ages and I'm like, oh boy. Yeah. And I'm a guy that I like to think I have it together now. So for me, I try not to get too wrapped up in it, because there are going to be guys that buck the trend. I think when it's more alarming, like when we're talking about the Josh Jackson or like the Kevin Porter type stuff, if it's a lot more serious or heavier, or like anything, even just like with like treatment of women, to me is kind of just like, no thanks, like see ya, don't want to deal with that. But if it's just like, this guy doesn't always practice hard, or maybe he doesn't always pay attention, or sometimes like that stuff I can deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to how much of a tolerance do you have for maybe a lack of maturity, because like you said, Maxwell, and sometimes you got to be careful with like what intel is coming out about, like, say, family stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think it's almost as important to know who it's coming from, and we never will.
Yeah.
As opposed to just like who it's coming out about, because like if someone is reporting that, you know, a young man has like a overly involved family or like a boisterous family, things like that, and the dude is like a 60-year-old, you know what I mean? Like, maybe there's like, maybe you're just like out of touch, so to speak, you know, maybe there's that. But yeah, I mean, once you get into the more serious stuff, you know, and I hate talking about like the negative outcomes of intel.
Sure.
And I love bolstering up, you know, your GG Jacksons and players like that who have bad intel and come in or success stories. Like, that's what we love to bolster up. I just think that every time we talk about those, maybe we don't have to say it out loud, but like maybe just like have a quick recall of like when there has been negative intel come out on a player and it's come true. It's like, that's why it's important to at least have that information and weigh it. You know what I mean? And then also remembering that maybe not every bit of negative information is going to get out, you know, for a multitude of reasons.
And I think with any work relationship, you want to have as much information as possible before you make a decision. And I think to your point too, there's also a lot of like, hey, where is this coming from? Why is this coming out? Does the team want a player to slide to them? Does an opposing agent want to put something out about a player to make it seem like they're bad? Like, it's funny, I talk to agents a lot. You'd be surprised how many players' agents were the best players in the team workouts that they were.
Of course, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where it's like a lot of stuff that you just kind of have to take with a grain of salt, unless it's a relationship where, you really trust the person, or the guy's going to be someone who's super honest with you. It's a lot easier when I've, talked to somebody who will tell me sometimes like, hey, my guy was fine. Like, you know what I mean? And then it's like, all right, now when I know when this guy tells me his player is the best person in the workout, maybe there's a little bit more to it. I think age plays a factor here too. Like, I'd be much more likely to take a chance on a guy that's like 18, 19 that has maturity concerns than a guy who's like been through 5 years of college. And it's like, oh man, I'd really feel better. Like, on the margins, I'm just going to have less of a tolerance for it. Like, to be completely frank, like if a guy is a top 10 talent, I can suck it up a little bit. Where if we're talking about a guy in the second round, it's like, I don't want my guy who's on a 2-way contract to be a pain in the butt. Like, there's something to that. So I think that plays a factor too.
Yeah. And I mean, if Anthony Edwards fancies himself as a rapping, football playing rapper as like while being in the NBA, maybe that's not that big of a deal, right? So
exactly. And this thing too is like, and I think that's the other thing too, is I think in the public it can be tricky because it's like there can be stuff where it's like, oh, there's like some bad intel on the guy, and then sometimes the bad intel is stuff where I'm like, I truly do not care. Like, there is like again,
Stephen Castle thinks that he can handle point guard responsibilities. What the heck,
Well, like, even that could be a thing where it's like, if I'm a team, like, yeah, I might bet, like, we talk about like the tolerance thing, and it's like, well, maybe if I'm a team picking and I like my point guard, or if I don't think he is a point guard, maybe that makes him a no-go for me. But if I'm a team where I'm like, you know what, maybe I'm rebuilding and maybe I give him some of those reps and he sees that's not what he is, and maybe we move him somewhere else, like, that can be the case, and maybe that'll work. And I also think it's important, I wanted to touch on this real quick, I think it's important to not overly buy into positive intel either. There are players who are great guys. My neighbor's a great guy. He doesn't play in the NBA. But even just like this guy is a winner stuff, and I'm a sucker for it. Like, I'm a real cornball.
Sure.
But like, Justice Winslow was a winner. Like, Justice Winslow won in college. He won at the high school level.
Justice Winslow.
He was awesome. And like, yeah, there's arguments to be made. Like, if he didn't have certain injuries, maybe his NBA career pans out a little bit differently.
Looked really good in Miami.
Yeah. Like, had some moments. But like, it doesn't always meet everything. Like, sometimes certain guys just can't figure out how to shoot a basketball. Or sometimes a guy works really hard, but they just don't have like the passing chops, or they're not athletic enough on defense, or whatever the issue is. Like, I think it's also really important to not just like talk yourself into someone being a great guy to the point that you put the blinders on, as far as like, that does not necessarily mean that they will become excellent at the game of basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a Mad Lib at that point, right? Like, how many adjectives and stuff like that can you associate? And Dirty Dancer even brings up Jared McCain gets so much credit for being personable when he thinks that he stinks from a tool standpoint. Like, that's I think that is one way that you could look at a Jared McCain, right? But there's also the alternative where he is one of the best shooters in this class, and people like playing with him, And
I think McCain is a guy where, like, to me, that is something I value, because like, if you were to tell me like, Jared McCain's this great shooter, he has subpar athleticism for an NBA guard, but if the intel is Jared McCain is a real butthead and thinks he's awesome and shows up late to practice all the time, I would not want to draft Jared McCain in the first round. The intel on Jared McCain has been the opposite. And that makes me think, you know what? Maybe he is subpar from a tool standpoint, but this is a guy who's going to figure out how to maximize his athleticism.
And like, rebounds incredibly well for his position. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, those are the things like you want to see. And like, that to me is where it's like, okay, well, maybe I'll be a little bit more to talk myself into something, but it's also, I don't want to be the guy who's like, oh man, I heard from someone who went to a Duke practice that Jared McCain was the most vocal guy on the floor. Jared McCain, top 3. You know what I mean? Like, it's like at this certain point,
it might like, help
yeah.
justify, like, it's just like a sweetener to justify where you have them. Yes. But like negative intel could be like where the bottom drops out a little bit, you know?
Sure.
Depending
so
on what the intel is. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think it's
very nuanced conversation.
It is. I think it's like the Bruce Lee, like, you want to be like water quote. I think you want to be like water with intel too. Like I think you want to Yeah, I think I just completely misapplied that quote. I think that quote is about like actually bending to the shape of whatever you're in. And I think you want to be fluid like water, but I also think you don't want to just like completely you don't want to be too much like, you want to be a little bit like water. You want to be so much like water that you're just like going into whichever
ice is like water.
The intel is telling you to go. Yeah, like you don't want to completely form your opinion of a player based on what people say about them as a guy when they are 18 to 22 years old. I think that's a little silly. So that's kind of where I stand on until I think it's a piece of the puzzle. And I also think too, like you're not going to have, I talked to a scout one time who used the phrase, like you're never going to have perfect information. Yeah. And I think that's like true about like statistics. Cause like we're dealing a lot of times like a 36 game sample on guys who are less with guys who are freshmen, but particularly with intel where it's like, you might have a scout who went to a practice, kids having a bad day, acts up a little bit and whatever. And maybe that's not totally indicative of who they are. Or maybe you have a coach who says, oh, I love this kid. He's a joy to have in practice. And maybe the kid's actually not a joy to have in practice. Or maybe they're not great. Like, I think you're never going to be around them all the time. And you're never going to have a fully formed picture of who anybody is based on meeting them a couple times or hearing a couple anecdotes about them as a person, especially with people that young in general. So I think it's important to not completely sell yourself on it the same way you wouldn't sell yourself on a 5 jump shot sample to grade out how good of a shooter a player is going to be.
Not that we would ever do that with a guy like Ulrich Tromsky or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, not that we would ever
not a lot of film there. You gotta hope, but
yeah. I mean, it's just like any other aspect that we assess these players on, right? Like, and just because, you know, they're a 35% intel shooter doesn't mean that they can't grow to be a 42 or whatever. You know, you see where I'm getting with this cheesy analogy, but I think the point's been made, Maxwell. Let's go ahead and wrap up the show, man.
Yeah, let's do it.
I know that we each have different things going on as the draft cycle is like starting to come to a close. What do you have going on in the works, brother?
Yeah, so we coordinated for a Bulls lottery preview that'll be out this week. I've been coordinating with Tyler Rucker on a Jazz lottery preview, which has been a blast. I think I've got like one other lottery preview coming out this week. It's a lot of lottery previews.
Yes.
I'm hoping to get this No Ceilings Plus like shooting piece out by the end of the week that I've been working on. I'm not sure like deadline wise what's going to happen. But yeah, just finishing up my scouting reports and doing a lot of teamwork behind the scenes here on those lottery previews. What about you?
I am heavily involved with the lottery preview series. You're probably not going to see a solo article for me throughout the rest of the cycle, just because working with the lottery pieces, working on clips and stuff like that.
You've been doing on the social front.
For sure, man. I mean, no one's doing as much as Paige. Shout out to Paige. She's a real MVP, but I'm trying to do what I can to help out across the board, man. But in the meantime, you know, just kind of solo projects for, you know, next cycle. I'm already starting to do my film dives and stuff like that for upcoming projects that we have. And draft guide, you know, can't tell you when. Even I don't know. It's such a mystery, but I could tell you it's going to be soon. And from what I have seen from Corey dropping some sneak peeks, man, like I'm probably like, I'm going to outright buy one just because I think that they're just too cool, man. Like I'm super excited for draft guide coming out. I'm excited for draft night. You know, we're going to have 2 nights, and we've already started to work with like different people of the No Ceilings crew are going to be involved at different times. And, you know, Maxwell, I don't know how you feel about the commentary that's associated with the draft on like these mainstream things. We haven't really had time to watch, but from what I hear, like on the draft lottery night, the commentary wasn't that great. I would never judge other commentary, but if you are interested in tuning in with us, we're gonna have some live streams coming out around that time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Stick with us. Stick with everything we're doing. Subscribe on all of our feeds, etc. You all know the deal. NoCeilingsNBA.com, No Ceilings NBA on Twitter, at Stephen G Hoops, at Boundboards. That'll do it for this week.
Thumbs up on the YouTubes.
Yep, thumbs up. Help us with the algorithm. So that does it. Stay tuned. Buy that draft guide when it comes out. It's a phenomenal way to support what we do, the best way to support what we do here at No Ceilings. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Until next week, we'll see you all later.
Much love, y'all.